Welcome to everybody in our virtual space and here in person with us for this very exciting event. I'm Michael Muki Cruz Manalili, honored to be our moderator for this event. And on behalf of the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics here at Boston College, as well as the current National Network for Flourishing in Health, we're excited to highlight the voice of a tremendous scholar in the field, Dan P. McAdams. The Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics at Boston College bridges psychological sciences with the humanities to explore deeply ethical questions of our human existence, potential, meaning, suffering. The current national network is a movement dedicated to advancing flourishing across the health ecosystem, and we could not think of a better scholar than Dan to invite for this event. Dan P. McAdams is the Henry Wade Rogers Professor of Psychology at Northwestern University, where he serves in terms of professor in education, prominent personality and developmental psychologist. He is best known for pioneering the life story model of human identity and the theory of narrative identity. One of his most influential books is The Redemptive Self, Stories Americans Live By, published in 2006, which won the American Psychological Association's William James Award. In this talk, Dan will unpack this and provide a broad overview of the empirical study of narrative identity in the fields of personality and lifespan developmental psychology, with emphasis on how people narrate experiences of suffering and adversity. 2 decades of research on highly generative, caring, and productive midlife American adults highlight features of a broad redemptive narrative that many Americans hold up as an ideal story for how to live a good life. Not only does he study this, personal anecdote, I was at an American Psychological Association asking questions for a poster on nadir experiences, and then somebody piped in the back. It was Dan, and just sharing wisdom in such a subtle way. When Dan kind of continued, his mentee noted that, oh yeah, that's Dan McAdams, and I was definitely taken aback at the way that he's able to share this wisdom without the types of ways that the academy kind of takes up too much space. One of my dear mentors too, practitioner of narrative therapy, eyes lit up when he said that Dan McAdams was the one giving this lecture. There's not a lot of people in this field that's able to marry things like the empirical sciences and deeply caring for people's stories. So without further ado, Stories of Redemption, Acceptance in American Lives by Dan McAdams. Thank you.
Let me turn my mic on first. The steps I have to go through. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Such an honor to be here. It's really great. It's been a wonderful day so far. I hope I don't wreck it with my talk. I think it should be okay. Nice to see you all this evening. I'm going to begin with a case. It's in my pocket. Born into a wealthy and esteemed family, this 18-year-old girl was attractive, intelligent, and highly articulate, and seemingly mature beyond her years. But she suffered from bouts of depression and suicidal thoughts, as well as odd somatic symptoms that flared up when she was feeling especially anxious. Her psychological problems were tangled up in a web of deceit and infidelity. Her father was carrying on a long-term affair with a good friend's wife. That same good friend, a middle-aged man of some renown in the community, shamelessly and repeatedly made sexual advances toward the young girl. which she steadfastly rejected, but on occasion seemed to desire. It began when he forced a kiss on her. She was all of 14 then. 2 years later, he explicitly propositioned the girl. She slapped his face and told her parents, but they seemed to think the incident was inconsequential. It was as if the girl were being offered up by her own father to his menacing friend in sexual exchange for the friend's wife. Her father now insisted that she see a psychotherapist. It was the fall of 1900. Freud called her Dora. In one of what may be one of the most famous case studies written in the psychoanalytic tradition, Sigmund Freud described his efforts to deconstruct Dora's symptoms and analyze her dreams to effect a psychological cure. He also aimed to formulate a full understanding of Dora's psychic life to showcase the power of his revolutionary psychoanalytic method. Freud failed on both counts, for just when he felt on the verge of a breakthrough, Dora cut the sessions off, as if to spite him. She reacted with disdain to his most imaginative interpretations of her lived experience. She rejected, for example, his interpretation of one of her dreams. No, she insisted, that dream was not a cleverly disguised tale of sexual longing, masturbation, bedwetting, and the desire to be saved by a powerful male force. Stunned by her refusal to endorse his ideas, Freud seemed to treat Dora as a cold specimen for his intellectual musings, rather than a vulnerable human being in need of sympathy, and they parted enemies. Well, for the rest of the 20th century, Freud's case study of Dora was both praised and vilified. The many critiques centered largely on the toxic sexism and the oppressive patriarchy on display in the text, perhaps not altogether surprising for the times, but still troubling. And there was the shocking disregard, recognized even at the time, that Freud seems to have shown in response to the suffering of this young girl. But many people also admired the case as written. Among Freud's greatest American admirers in the years following World War II was a man named Stephen Marcus, who was a practicing psychoanalyst and a literary critic. In a highly influential paper published in 1977, Marcus hailed Freud's case study of Dora as a harbinger of a new genre in modern literature, akin to the writings of Joyce and Proust. Moreover, the Dora case suggests a deep truth about psychological health and pathology, Marcus argued, a truth about which Freud was only glancingly cognizant. Like other hysterics he had treated, Freud noted, Dora had a difficult time providing an ordered history for her life. There was a degree of incoherence in her manifest life story. Whereas Freud did not foreground the role of narrative and storytelling in psychoanalysis back then, Marcus put forth the novel possibility, based on his reading of Freud's Dora, that stories may indeed lie at the heart of it all. Stories may be centrally responsible for the extent to which people live well or poorly, and stories may be foundational for the psychotherapeutic cure. And this is a quote from this article that Stephen Marcus wrote. He said, "What we are led at this juncture to conclude is that Freud is implying that a coherent story is in some manner connected with mental health, or at the very least, with the absence of hysteria. And this in turn implies assumptions of the broadest and deepest kind about both the nature of coherence and the form and structure of human life. On this reading, human life is ideally a connected and coherent story, with all the details in explanatory place, and with everything, or as close to everything that is practically possible, accounted for in its proper causal or other sequence. And inversely, illness amounts, at least in part, to suffering from an incoherent story or an inadequate narrative account of oneself." Now in the 1980s, early 80s to mid 80s, I was teaching at Loyola University of Chicago. It was my first gig, my first professional job, postgraduate school. And I was teaching courses on developmental psychology, and we were fascinated back then, the students and I, with the concept of identity, as Erik Erikson had written about it. But like, what was identity? And reading passages like this, which I read back then in the early 80s by Stephen Marcus, and a whole slew of other philosophers and theologians and psychoanalysts especially, it sort of dawned on me that possibly that, well, maybe we should start thinking about identity, who a person is, in terms of their story. Like, you are a story. You're walking around with a narrative in your mind about who you are and how you came to be. And what Freud thought was kind of inconsequential, the fact that Dora could not construe her life in a historically kind of coherent manner, actually was pretty important. And that maybe we got to start thinking about people in terms of who they are, and so forth, their lives, and what gives their lives meaning and purpose in terms of the stories though they're walking around with. And I think I imagined back then, because I had a background in literature, that it was almost if each of us is like Tolstoy or Dickens or Jane Austen, and we're working on this novel, and it's about ourselves, and it's in our minds. And we, every day we add to it, and we tweak it, and we have social interactions and exchanges that shape it. And I thought that's kind of a cool idea. Today it sounds kind of obvious, but back in the 1980s, people weren't talking, everyday folks weren't talking that way about their lives, as if they were stories with chapters and characters and settings and themes and plots. So let's start thinking about it that way. And gradually, many people came around to this view. It's been out there, it's not completely original with me, that identity or certain features of identity are like a life story. So let's call it this, narrative identity, and internalize it a long story of itself, but explains how I came to be the person I am becoming. And these stories, well, everybody in the room is sophisticated enough to know that they're not like you push the replay button and your life just plays out in retrospect. It's not like that. It's highly selective and reconstructed. The past is. You forget 98% of whatever happened. There's no need to remember it. Like, what did you eat for breakfast 3 weeks ago? Who cares, right? But maybe a conversation you had that day with your mother, where she told you something you never knew before, that sticks out. That kind of makes the cut. That stays with you, and maybe that memory, as it changes over time, because your take on it will change over time, maybe that gets in to this story that you're creating about who you are and how you came to be. Maybe that makes the cut when it comes to your narrative identity, or maybe it makes it for a while, until it loses interest. You lose interest in it, and other events come in. And so this story is evolving as you change over time. It's not fixed. Incorporating a reconstruction of the past and an anticipation of the imagined future. Stories serve to integrate your life in time. So I began doing life story interviews in the 1980s. I just made them up. This just seemed intuitively, this is what you want to know, right? If you ask a person about their life story, first you have to tell them, let's pretend that you're an author, you're a novelist, and you're writing the story about your life. And let's talk about the big chapters. What are the major chapters? Give me the table of contents of your life story, and maybe like little chapter titles, something like that. And I thought, people, maybe they won't be able to do this. Maybe people will think, this is weird. Like, I never thought about my life as if it were a book with chapters. And hardly anybody said that. Lots of people say, oh yeah, I can do that. Yeah, sure, no problem, right? Tell me about high points, the best moment that ever occurred in your life. Well, there have been many. Pick one. Okay. What happened? Who was there? What were you thinking and feeling? What do you think it means? Key question. Low points. What's the worst moment in your life? Most of the people I was interviewing early in my career, and this has been true mostly for most of my career, were midlife people. People in their 30s, 40s, 50s, right? Young and midlife. So bad things have happened by then. They happened earlier too. So everybody has some sort of story of suffering to talk about with respect to their low points, maybe their turning points in their lives. Who are the important characters? Who are the heroes and villains in your story? Where's the story going? What's the next chapter going to be? What's the future script? Towards the end of the interview, and these interviews go like maybe an hour and a half or so. This is just a précis of them. Let's talk about your personal beliefs and values. What do you really care about in terms of politics, in terms of religious values and ethics and so forth? And at the end of the interview, we ask the person to kind of sum it up. So now we've been talking for an hour and a half or so. We've been tape recording it. We're going to transcribe it later and work with those texts. What do you think your life means in the overall? Is there a single theme or motif that runs through it? And people often have very interesting things to say about that. I believed back then, and I mostly believe today, that most people have a story in their heads, or a set of stories, an anthology of narratives in their minds about who they are and how they came to be. And they trot them out every once in a while, like for job interviews and so forth. But the stories are there that sort of guide you in your major life decisions, and they change over time. So we could interview all kinds of people about their life stories. Who you want to focus on? And somewhere along the way, I decided I want to focus on what Erik Erikson would have described, going back to him again, as generative adults. Right? These are highly productive and caring people. I'm interested in those kinds of people. I'm interested in this idea of generativity. Erikson talked about generativity as the midlife adult's concern for promoting the well-being of future generations. And you can do that through parenting, teaching, leading, mentorship, leadership. There's all kinds of ways to be generative. And, well, we need to find the really generative people out there and do interviews with them, because it's really hard to be generative. I mean, there's all kinds of other things you could do with your life, maybe. Like, why raise kids? Why join some community group to try to change for the better the world you live in? Why agitate for political justice? Why work for this candidate as opposed to just staying home and not even turning on CNN to find out about the elections? It would be easier to do all that kind of stuff. But some people really step up in their midlife years and become highly generative, and I'm thinking, whoa, you need a really good story. Everybody needs a good story, but maybe you really need a good story to support a highly generative life. So at least that was my inclination going in. And by the way, these generative people, how do you find them? I'm a personality psychologist, I admit it, right? And we're very interested in measurement and individual differences between people. And the idea is that some people are more generative than others at any given time in life. And so we give them items like this that come from what's called the Loyola Generativity Scale, and you rate yourself on these kinds of items. I try to pass along knowledge I've gained from my experience. I think I would like the work of a teacher and so forth, right? And you maybe rate yourself on a 1 to 4 scale, with 4 being, yeah, I'm totally like that. And 1, no, that's not me at all. And everybody lies a little bit on these, but we kind of assume everybody lies about the same amount. And there is a lot of variation, a bell-shaped curve on these measures, and I won't get into it, but there is decades of construct validity research showing that these goofy little items added up together into these scales do indeed predict individual differences in generativity. So let's imagine that we have some people in my study, and they've all scored really high on this kind of measure. And we're comparing their stories to everybody else's stories. What do their stories sound like? Let's listen to this little account first. This is an account of a negative childhood scene told by a 57-year-old woman who is in our study way back because she scored so high on measures of generativity. She says, I was in the 1st grade. This is a negative event in my life when I was little, and I was told that I had this terrible illness. It turns out it's rheumatoid arthritis. This comes up in the interview again and again, and that would make my knees swollen, and I was going to have to stay in bed. And at the Catholic school, the nuns, they were so great. I mean, they said, you know, you're very special to have this. God would only do this to somebody very, very special. And so that gave a little kid an idea of, oh, so this isn't something that I should be feeling sorry for myself about. This should be, well, a gift. And I was stupid enough that I bought it, but I'm telling you, it helped. And this is a complicated memory, right? She calls it negative, but it's not all negative. And she says she was stupid, but she really is happy that she believed the nuns. And maybe the nuns believed what they said. And so it's kind of there's a mixed kind of quality to this in terms of the emotions. I'm interested in two themes, though, that come out in that story and that show up, as you'll see, again and again in the life narrative is told by highly generative, that is, caring and productive midlife adults. Early advantage. The narrator indicates that they have experienced an advantage or distinction, be it physical, material, psychological, relational, social, that singles them out for special positive attention. Right? I had this illness. I thought it was bad. It's a gift. It turns out to be a gift. I frame it as an early advantage. Other people didn't have it. God picked me. Second, redemption sequence. The narrator describes a movement in the scenario from a demonstrably negative situation to a positive outcome of some kind or another. This is a classic theme, comes up again and again in people's life stories. And the positive outcome can be something like, you learned something important from the bad experience, you took home a lesson, or it may simply be a positive change, like first marriage, disaster. We broke up, it was horrible. Within a week, I had met the love of my life. Okay, that would be a redemption sequence, right? From negative to positive. It's how you sequence it in your telling. Here's another one. Negative childhood scene from a 64-year-old white man. It's important to know that he's white. I was probably in first grade, and my brother was probably 4 years old when we were playing in the front yard, bored out of our minds, as we always were. And a neighbor lady basically, she abducted us. It was a Sunday, I guess, and she took us to the Baptist church. My mom let her do it so she could sleep in and get some rest from us. Billy, I guess the brother, and I became devout Christians eventually, and that was mainly good. But the church was all white. So when the blacks moved into the neighborhood, the church bus got rerouted so that it would not go down those streets. I was probably in 8th grade when that happened, and it bothered me a lot. I wanted to speak out against it, but I was afraid. There were serious racists in this church, including some of my friends. So I just shut up. Looking back, it was good and bad, I guess. I stayed with my Christian faith. It's a 64-year-old man still stays with his faith here, but I rejected the racism. Still today, that is what I'm about. One of the reasons I volunteer at the food pantry and support progressive political candidates is that I believe that I'm doing God's work when I do that. Yeah, even if my childhood church had some backward ideas. Lots going on in this memory, but let me point to 3 more themes. There's 5 in total. This is 3, 4, and 5. Sensitivity to the suffering of others. The narrator expresses awareness of or sympathy for pain or problems that other people experience, or shows a sensitivity to perils, dangers, or broad problems in society. Moral steadfastness. The narrator emphasizes strong religious, political, or social values which motivate behavior. The values are central to their identity and unshakable. And finally, pro-social goals. The narrator sets forth or describes goals, plans, or hopes that involve contributing to the well-being of others beyond one's own family, like working in a soup kitchen and so forth. So I just told you really briefly here, skimming quickly through, about 5 themes. And I've laid them out now here on a kind of temporal sequence as they might play out in a person's life story. Do know that this is a kind of generic, idealized sequence of themes. Nobody's life story fits this perfectly, and we're just kind of interested in the extent to which an individual's themes in their life story kind of connect to these. So let's just get all 5 of them down just really quickly again. Early advantage and the suffering of others. I like to pit those 2 against each other, and they often do come up early in the narrative accounts. Early advantage, right? Mom liked me the best. God picked me for this. I had some special talent that nobody else had. Everybody in the room, I suppose, could probably come up with something that feels bad. And I had this advantage maybe when I was 10 or 15. But would you highlight that? Would you make that a big deal in your narrative identity? Some people do. Some not so much. Suffering of others. Again, something that everybody knows and knew probably at a young age. The world is not fair. Bad things happen to good people. There's prejudice. There's hatred. There are wars. Did this have a big impact on you, and do you decide to like foreground it in your narrative identity? So put those two together, early advantage and suffering mothers, and there's a little message here about how the story starts. It's like, I'm blessed, I'm lucky, and others suffer. Or I am the gifted protagonist who journeys forth into a dangerous world. Highly generative American adults love to talk that way about their lives, right? And you can sort of see why. In retrospect, you are a highly generative person. You're out there making a difference in the world. You know that. They don't know the word generativity, most of them, but they know. Highly generative people are not modest. They know that they are out there trying to make a difference in the world, and they will tell you about it, right? And like, well, why? Well, maybe because I was special early on. I got this break or whatever. The nuns thought I was really cool, whatever it was. And God knows the world needs people like me because there is suffering, right, out there. And so it's almost like a moral justification in a way for setting up your life to be a generative person. I see this story as like supporting generativity in some ways. Moral depth and steadfastness. I did not like this theme at first. I still have ambivalence about it. I had thought originally that highly generative adults would be questers, right? Constantly questioning life, growing, building, and wondering about the meaning, and like, they don't have time for that. Did that back in college. I was at Boston College. I took a few philosophy courses, and we did that stuff. And I worked on it, but I'm 40. I got 2 kids. I'm president of the PTA. I got so many things to worry about. I know my values. I know what they are now. And they are central to me and strong. Highly generative adults love to talk about their values. Of course, we all have values, right? And they know that we all have values, but their values are central. Right? Do I make them sound self-righteous and a little bit self-preoccupied? I don't mean to do that, because after all, this is just a story. It's not like them, it's their story. But you get a little bit of that sometimes, right? Redemption, the key theme in my mind, right? Again and again, highly generative adults will tell you about suffering, almost as if they revel in it. Bad things happen to me left and right, folks. But often, not always, often something positive comes out of that, the redemption theme. And finally, as I look to the future, the highly generative adult tells you, I see future growth, I see pro-social engagement. Yeah, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, God knows, read the news every morning. It's terrible. But in my little neck of the woods, whatever that is, we're making progress. We're doing something that we hope, we think, we pray might be of long-term positive significance. Okay? Does your life story sound like that? Right? Is your narrative identity like that? Nobody's is exactly, but highly generative adults, our research suggests, their stories resemble this more so than do less generative adults. Well, how do I know that? Okay? So this is where the personality psychology geek comes out. We have to measure this some way. We can't just say it. We can't just pull out cool case studies, although I do that a fair amount. You actually have to like show some quantitative data. So how would you do that? It's really simple. This is how we do it. We divide the story, the interview, up into scenes. Like, I think that's my phone, but we'll let that go. I told my wife not to call. There 5 scenes, okay? You have to be, I could have a bunch of them, but I just picked 5, right? So these are chunks of text. We work with texts that are typed up, right? And so we ask a question about a high point, and a person talks about it, and maybe we'll ask a follow-up, and then that ends, and we go to the next one. So we get that chunk, maybe that's 2 pages, right? On the high point scene. We get a chunk on the low point scene, turning point scene, life challenge, dreams, hopes for the future, there's others. Let's just think about these 5. And each of these scenes, you read it, or multiple coders read it, and they decide, is the theme there or not? Those are the 5 themes across the top: early advantage, suffering mothers, moral steadfastness, redemption sequences, and pro-social goals. That is to say, these 5 themes. And well, here we go. Here's some subject we just made up. And it turns out in this individual's high point scene, there's one example of moral steadfastness, and there's a pro-social goals. But we don't have the other 3. And it's real simple. It's hard to get reliability. There's coding manuals and so forth, but eventually we get it. And we add these numbers up. And we get scores that refer to or index the extent to which the theme is present in the story. Some people have a lot of this redemption stuff, some people don't. And then here's my only quantitative data slide. Apologies for folks who maybe aren't too keen on this, but this is important data for people who do the kind of thing I do. These are correlations and regression coefficients, and basically what they are trying to determine is what the relationship is between well-validated self-report measures of certain important things, especially think generativity, that top line there, on the one hand, and the density, you might say, the how much of the narrative theme in question is present in the life story interviews for 157 midlife adults. I mean, this took like 4 years to do. It was a lot of work, all the coding and so on. And so these correlations going across the top here, 0.28, 0.34, and so forth. And the regression coefficients are just a variation on that, the control for various things. Basically, what they show is that these are statistically significant relationships such that, yes, there is some evidence. It's not a perfect fit by any means, but it does look like people who score high on generativity, for example, based on our self-report measures, they do show higher density of early advantage theme in their life stories compared to people who score lower in generativity. It's a linear kind of relationship. There are always exceptions. You can always find somebody who's high in generativity whose story looks nothing like the redemptive self, and the reverse, people who are low in generativity who are telling you about redemption and early advantage over and over. But the statistical tendency is rather robust for research like this, and especially when you look at the composite, the far right thing there, and that's just adding up the 5 themes. And you see there a very high correlation for social science research between generativity and this kind of story. Why are these stories associated with midlife generativity and well-being? I suggested one reason earlier when I pitted early advantage against the suffering of others to suggest that these highly generative adults, as they look back on their life, and it's almost like they're asking themselves, why the heck am I so generative or something like that? They're sort of saying to themselves, well, I was lucky. Good things happened to me. Now, by the way, they don't have to be rich and well off. There is no relationship between generativity and socioeconomic status in our data. They don't have to be men or women, black, white. I mean, it's all, those variables don't matter. They don't account for much in terms of statistical variation. But it's like, I guess I have gratitude. Right? Good things happened to me early on, people, and I remember that, and I'm grateful. And so maybe that's part of the dynamic here, we don't really know. But people who are grateful want to give back in some way, and so generativity falls from that. But there's other things too that go back to, for example, my talking about how generativity is really hard, because it doesn't always work out. I love my children, but raising children is not easy. And they don't always do exactly what you want them to do, and they don't exactly lead the lives that you kind of imagined when they were like little babies and so forth. And we struggle, right? But imagine you've got a story like this that says, hey, you've been through so much. I mean, like that first job that you bombed out on, the bad parenting you suffered through, or this negative thing, that negative thing. And many times, positive things came out of that. So if your story tells you that oftentimes negative leads to positive, maybe that helps you to take on the challenge of generativity, because this is another tough one, but I think maybe I'll get through it, because after all, look what happened back then and there and so forth. So I think that there are a number of ways to argue that this kind of redemptive story would fit generativity kind of nicely. Some people have argued that the redemptive self, as I've described it to you, these 5 themes, is a master cultural narrative in American society, which is to say that it's a favorite, that Americans know these kinds of stories and they love them. And I think this is true. There are many examples in American history and heritage of profoundly redemptive narratives, and Americans have cherished these kinds of stories, from stories of atonement that move from sin to salvation, it's always from negative to positive, to stories of upward social mobility, to stories of liberation. And Oprah, who's so great in terms of like as a narrator for redemptive stories, stories of recovery. In stories of recovery, it goes like this. Once upon a time, I was fine. I was healthy. I was not addicted. Nobody had abused me. I was happy and good. And then bad stuff happened. I got sick. I became addicted. I ran into trouble with the law. Whatever it was, I went through a really bad period. And now I'm trying to get back. I'm trying to recover that original goodness, that realization of that original goodness. That's a very powerful redemptive story. Many people tell that story about their lives or stories like that. So these are just 4 variations on. You could list others. So I don't want to say that it's only in America that people have stories like this. That's not the case. But I do believe that narrative identities are strongly inflected by culture. And there is something, sort of American about the stories I've described here. And it's as if highly generative adults in our society, they are the flag wavers on it. They are the ones who are out there speaking up for these kinds of master cultural narratives. What's not to like here? 85% of me likes the redemptive self. And I think it's really great that in struggling to be a generative person in midlife, that a story like this can support your efforts. And I see myself a little bit in the redemptive self, and I like to think that I'm a generative person. But I showed my daughter one time the Loyola generativity scale. It was like on my office door. I don't know why. And she was reading. She goes, "Oh, Mommy and Daddy, you and I are like that." I thought, wow, it's like the greatest compliment I ever got. So at least my kid thought I was a generative adult. So it's I don't want to criticize it, but there's some things about the redemptive self that are annoying. The self-righteousness sometimes that comes out with that moral steadfastness thing. The confidence that runs through it. And after all, sometimes things happen that are so bad that you can't redeem them, right? And it's naive. In fact, in some ways, maybe you are selling short personal suffering by suggesting that should lead to something good. I find myself doing this a lot of times. Students will come in my office, they'll talk about something really, really bad that happened in their life. And I'm listening and I'm sympathetic. I'm thinking, okay, let's get to the redemptions. Let's get them out of this, right? And usually it does, because people sort of expect to hear that, but not always. And indeed, we all know that there are a lot of bad things that don't get redeemed. So is it not perhaps sometimes naive to hold so much faith in this kind of story? And I think, yeah, sometimes it is, right? And so let's talk about, in the time remaining here, an alternative. There's many we could talk about. A kind of alternative story that maybe deserves more credit, and that's associated maybe not so much with midlife generativity, as great as that is, but maybe something about later life. And again, I go back to Erik Erikson, with apologies for you who are not all that familiar with Erik Erikson, because I do draw on him a lot. But whereas Erikson talked about midlife as being a time for generativity, he talks about later life as being a time for what he calls ego integrity. And ego integrity refers to the extent to which you are able to look back on your life and accept it in some kind of graceful way. The acceptance of one's life is something that has been and continues to be good. The sense that one's life is a gift that has been bestowed upon a person. And you can feel this at any age, of course, but Erikson likes to peg it to the later ages. And it's associated, Erikson argues, with the virtue of wisdom. So are there stories that kind of go with this? My student Holland Reicher suggested that maybe there was. So she analyzed life story accounts for 2 narrative themes that she cares a lot about. One she calls self-transcendence, and the other is renunciation of regret. These themes are not associated with generativity, as it turns out. They don't track the redemptive self, but they were connected in her research with self-reports of ego integrity. So people who say to you that they're like this tend to tell life stories that are a little bit like this on the screen, or at least statistically so. She also finds that there's a significant increase in these themes of self-transcendence and renunciation of greed between the ages of 60 and 65. She gets this from this longitudinal study we've been doing where we follow people between the ages of 55 and 65, and she sees an increase in these themes, which I think is kind of interesting. Right? So what do these kinds of stories sound like? I don't have as much data here. I spent 20 years plus on the redemptive self. My students and I have really dug into it. This is, for us, a little new, although the ideas are probably not unfamiliar to you. So here are some examples of the voices that we might associate with this kind of story. This person's talking about a positive event in their life, and they say, it shows that I accept change and I'm kind of a roll with the punch person. So I realized that my life had completely changed, but I accepted it. And so I think I'm kind of lucky because I do accept change pretty well, and I'm kind of a reactive person rather than a proactive person. And so when things change, it doesn't destroy my world. I go, oh, cool. Well, I guess I have to adapt to this. That helps make me a happier person because I'm just that way naturally. And someone who is more adamant that things be a certain way, well, that can be a real liability. She's kind of pegging a little bit the redemptive self story. Remember that moral steadfastness that goes with the redemptive self, the overcoming adversity, this confidence that you're going to work it out. And she's sort of saying here, I think it's a she, I'm actually not sure, that, well, if you've got that kind of story, maybe you're not flexible, you know? And I have to say that, you know, when I wrote the book, The Redemptive Self, I kind of comment a little bit about some of the shortcomings of the story and so on, and the people who tell it. As much as I admire generativity and the redemptive self, there's something a little heavy about it. And sometimes highly generative people, and I plead guilty to being highly generative, but I mean, sometimes there's just a kind of like seriousness that is a little over the top, and you want to kind of go lighten up a little and so on. So you know, there's something going on there maybe. I've had to deal with tremendous change, and it doesn't do any good to yell and scream about it. It only does you good if you learn to deal with it. If it rains, don't yell at the rain, just buy an umbrella. I'm more mature because I've done a lot of things that I really don't want to do, but I did them because, you know, well, it needs to be done. We're talking here partly, maybe, as Erickson suggested, about wisdom. There's a long tradition of wisdom and theological studies and so forth in the Christian church and Judaism and other religious traditions as well, Islam. And I'm just skimming the surface of it. I'm really not a deep expert. But as I read these various sources, it seems to me that wisdom is, among other things, operating effectively in an ambiguous world wherein human beings face implacable limitations on what they can do and know. It's complicated. There's no clear right answer. Moral steadfastness might not get you there when it comes to wisdom. You might have to compromise. You might have to do stuff that you don't think you might have done before, but like maybe you feel like there's no choice. There's a kind of like a little bit of a realization of the limits of one's agency that comes with wisdom. And there's a lot of ideas related to that are sort of out there in these various interesting literatures in the social sciences and humanities, such as social gerontology and disability studies. So in the social gerontology literature, scholars have been talking about this kind of thing for a long time, right? They'll talk about acceptance, you know, learning to live with or come to terms with suffering and limitations and constraints as you get older, because you can't always overcome adversity and triumph in the end. But it's not resignation. It's not like you're giving up and saying, woe is me, there's no way I can deal with it. It's different than that. Although I'm not exactly sure I understand exactly what the difference is, but I kind of get the feel of it. Something about a kind of gracious acceptance that still enables you to fight back when you need to, as opposed to just giving in straight up. Gubrium, Kenyon, there's other people who write about this. Toni Morrison, I think, gestures towards it here when she wrote, I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and although it is important not to ignore pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge. There's a little bit of a redemptive meaning in that as well. But I think there's this understanding in Toni Morrison. If you've read Toni Morrison, you know that this is very much like what she's about in many ways. And that is that, you know, the world is completely imperfect and chaotic and so forth. And how you get through it, sometimes you have to succumb, or there's the concern that you could succumb to the malevolence of it, so you have to refuse to do that, you have to fight. but at the same time, you can't ignore the pain, the suffering. Sometimes simply bearing witness to it is what a protagonist of a good story needs to do. There's also great stuff on disability studies. My good friend and colleague Jonathan Adler, former student of mine, teaches at down the road here at Olin College of Engineering and also at Wellesley. He teaches a little bit there. He has written a lot about life narrative, narrative identity as it applies to people with disabilities of various kinds. And he talks about what it's his term, or not his term, he borrows it from disability studies. He calls it crypt porn. It's an evocative idea. But these are stories of incredible overcoming, where people have these debilitating disabilities, be they physical or sometimes emotional or mental, and they do these amazing things. Like they've lost their legs, and they get the prosthetic, and they run races and win races. And, all these are heartwarming, incredible stories, and they're so rare. Like, how often does that happen? How many people, after they lose their legs, are going to run a race and win? Maybe one or two, and that's what we read about on the inspiring websites and in the magazines and so forth. But it's kind of like porn. It attracts us, right? It's alluring and so on, and it's not real. Or it's real for those people, but for most of us it isn't. So it sets up these expectations. If I'm afflicted with a particular disability, then that's what I need to do. I need to have that kind of redemptive story about my life. And Adler is saying, and many people with disability studies are saying, no. I mean, come on. You have to learn to come to terms with it. I mean, it's great to try to overcome adversity, and sometimes it works, but that's just setting up expectations that are likely to be too difficult. And so I'm playing around with, and this is my last slide here, what I guess I would call them narratives of acceptance. These are they're not in total contrast to the redemptive self, but they do contrast the redemptive self in some ways, as ego integrity contrasts with generativity, you might say. Generativity is a more active kind of thing. You're out there creating and making things happen and making the world a better place, and God knows we need that. It's very important. I consider generativity to be maybe a cardinal virtue. And yet, you can't always be generative, and you live a life that there's a lot of constraint and so forth, be it disability, be it aging and whatever. And so different stories might be needed. Stories that where the setting is uncertainty, unpredictable change, and serendipity. I think of COVID period, that we all went through a few years ago, the COVID period, and how there was just a sense of uncertainty, right? Especially before the vaccines showed up. And what's going to happen next? And some people live in that kind of world a lot, right? By virtue of their economic situation, by virtue of where they live in the world, right? Maybe they're living in Beirut these days. Uncertainty, unpredictable change. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So that's kind of the setting here of this kind of story. And what's the goal? Well, it's not necessarily to overcome adversity, although God knows that would be great. And maybe that's the first choice, if you can do it. But here, I think it's more about coming to terms. Coming to terms with life, reconciliation, management of adversity, sustaining bonds of intimacy and warmth. That's more front and center in this kind of story. Not that the redemptive self story doesn't have some of that, it does, but it's more featured here. The temporal focus is a little bit more on the here and now, because the here and now is so overwhelming. In redemptive life stories, there's these long-term goals, and people are striving and overcoming adversity and obstacles along the way. This is a little different. Now, what kind of protagonist do you want for this kind of story? Well, for the redemptive self, you want somebody who has grit, and somebody who has resolve, and knows what they believe in, and fights the good fight no matter what, and pursues the goal with their eyes on the prize, right? And they're resilient, and they're able to come back from negative things. Here, love all those things, but the featured virtues in my mind, the ideal characteristics of the protagonist, have to do more with grace, humility, flexibility, perhaps, being ready to go with the flow, not knowing what's going to happen next, but nonetheless being kind of ready to take it on and come to terms with it, no matter what comes your way. So I'd like to leave you with the idea that all three things. Narrative identity, it's a thing. People have life stories, most people, and they give your life meaning and purpose. Redemptive stories are cool. Highly generative adults in American society, at least, often, although not always, will tell redemptive stories about their lives, and people find them inspiring sometimes. And redemptive stories aren't the be-all and end-all. There are other ways to narrate good lives, ways we haven't talked about here. But an interesting alternative, I think, is these kinds of stories, narratives of acceptance, where our goal is to come to terms with the constraints we face and with the sufferings that we endure in our daily lives. Thank you. Who's in charge here? What happens next? Do I take questions? You're the man. Okay.
Definitely not in charge. Just moving a little along. Thank you so much, Dan McAdams, for inviting us to think deeply about how narrative shapes our understandings of acceptance and redemption. I'm very struck by the way it correlates with things like flourishing and even some of the other scores that we've seen. So much more thoughts on that in due time. For this portion of our presentation now, I'm very honored to invite two other folks up here, and then we'll have some time for questions and dialogue, both for our virtual audience and those in the room. So very excited for that. First, I'd like to welcome Chris Higgins, who is the chair of the Department of Formative Education. One of his prominent books is Undeclared: The Philosophy of Higher Education, a critical philosophical examination of modern university education, arguing for a return to the formative mission focused on personal growth, self-discovery, and meaning, rather than just credentialing. And our other dialogue partner is Patrick Conway, who is the inaugural Ignacio Chair and Director of Boston College's Prison Education Program. Under his leadership, the program awarded its first diplomas at the prison commencement ceremony in 2024. Patrick hopes to make a positive impact on the lives of all of our students to help rethink and reimagine the role of education in prisons. So first off, I'd like to invite Chris up to offer some remarks.
Would you rather go first? It's up to you. I'll let you go.
All right.
Rookie.
Why don't you invite them
I always wanted to sit in one of these chairs. Oh, thank you.
And Patrick,
I'm a little scared to get up there.
here as well. And Dan, would you mind joining as well? We'll make it a bit of a dialogue.
Could I stand here?
Yeah. Great.
And then I'll sit in the chair later, because the chairs are cool for sure. Dan, thank you so much. There was a lot, and I didn't have the paper in advance, so
This is unfair.
it's kind of an exciting feeling of like, in 20 minutes, I'm going to say something, I have no idea what it is. In 10 minutes, I'm going to say something. Here we are, so we'll see what comes out. I thought I would, I didn't touch anything, okay. I thought I would try to talk about two things that two main points that your talk raised for me. One has to do with what I'll call narrative frames. We could use the word genres, but I think that might get us thinking in too specific of a direction. So for now, I'll just call them narrative frames. And then I want to say something about what I'll call narrative threats. Okay, so what you've given us are two genres or frames or narrative structures or repeating narratives. Very interesting. I'd love to talk more about exactly, I really liked when you said, I'm 85% happy with the redemptive self-narrative. I like that. It's good that you're scientific even when it comes to assessing your own level of commitment to your construct. But I just really like the fact that you let in that normative piece. Like, how do we feel about this story? How do we feel about these slightly insufferable people that are so sure that they were marked out as special from a very young age and so on and so forth?
Careful, you might be one of them.
Okay. But what I want to do is I want to multiply our list of narrative frames. So we can think about just how rich is the assortment of genres or frames we have, and think about their relation. So let's start with the consideration of what every one of us has experienced, which are family narratives. Right? The way in which you feel like from a very young age, you're living into and perhaps pushing against a story that you've inherited, a sort of a narrative slot in your family. I see some people shaking their heads. It's not always pleasant either. And one of the ones I inherited was my dad, a wrestling coach, told me, Chris, Higginses never give up. Now that's an interesting trick, right? There are moments where I'm very close to giving up, and I hear that voice and I think, is that insanity? And actually the correct course right now is to give up. Like if I'm playing a board game with my young daughter, shouldn't I go ahead and give up? So these kind of narrative frames that come from the family, from family traditions, maybe as a way of dealing with contradictions that the family felt, or dealing with traumas. Then we could add to that, so a thinker I really like, maybe some of you have read, is Alistair McIntyre and his sort of magnum opus, After Virtue, 1981. McIntyre talks about the stock of stories available in a culture at any one time. And let me just read you a tiny little bit of it. Luckily, I have all these PDFs on my computer. So I'm like, I think I'll use McIntyre. Oh, here it is. So McIntyre says that humans are essentially a storytelling animal. And we're not essentially, but become, through our histories, tellers of stories that aspire to truth. I'd like to keep that idea sort of hanging in the air. At what moments can we say a narrative is alive to who we are, as simply creating who we are? And then he goes on to say that you can't understand yourself unless you ask the question of what story or stories do I find myself a part of? We enter human society, I'm quoting now, that is with one or more imputed characters, roles into which we have been drafted. And we have to learn what they are in order to be able to understand how others respond to us and how our responses to them are apt to be construed. It is through hearing stories about wicked stepmothers, lost children, good but misguided kings, wolves that suckle twin boys, youngest sons who receive no inheritance but must make their own way in the world, and eldest sons who waste their inheritance on riotous living and go into exile to live with the swine, that children learn or mislearn both what a child and what a parent is, what the cast of characters may be in the drama into which they have been born, and what the ways of the world are. Deprive children of stories, McIntyre writes, quote, and you leave them unscripted, anxious stutterers in their actions as in their words. So I think for many of us, this text was just a very powerful moment of trying to think through how deeply the concept of narrative and the concept of selfhood are intertwined. So I think that's a little different than family narratives, but we can imagine the reading of stories about wicked stepmothers happening in the context of family. My third category is the sort of barrage of interpolations we get from media, from every which direction. Interpolation is a story that has a spot for you, an idea of who you are, built into the way it addresses you. Interpolation is a mode of address. You find yourself, when you're watching a commercial, right? If somebody is telling me, that if I use Axe body spray, I'll really attract a lot of women, I can try to step out of that and say, but the commercial has an idea of who I am. I'm a guy who's having trouble, who just needs a little more gain. And it all comes down to the armpits, right? So an interpolation has a picture of who you are. It hails you in a certain way. And we're being barraged by these sort of narratives all the time. So that's a third category. I think a fourth is also inspired by McIntyre. McIntyre talks about the goods internal to practices. So when we apprentice ourselves to a practice, whether it's a work practice or an avocation, his list of practices is incredibly wide. One of the things we can derive from learning to be a gardener or a philosopher or what have you is that there's he calls it a kind of biographical genre. There's something that there's meaning to the idea of living the life of a painter, of living the life of a teacher, of living the life of a gardener Your fingers are always, my wife's a gardener, and there's no soap that will get that dirt out of the fingernails at a certain point, and that's part of living the life of a gardener. So I think this is another kind of narrative frame that's incredibly important. One of the reasons we apprentice ourselves to practices is to have that resource. Now, Warhol's not the same as Pollock, who's not the same as Frida Kahlo, but all of them inherited, along with the practice, a flexible narrative structure for making sense of what you do when you rise in the morning, of what you're proud of how you comport yourself in social life. So we'll call those vocational genres. And last but not least, very wide epical frame. So here I'm thinking of another favorite philosopher, Charles Taylor. If you haven't yet, go out right now, get his book, Sources of the Self, and read it. It's only about 600 pages. I think you'll like it. And one of the things, what he does is he tells a history of our idea of the self. And he shows that something very fundamental to how we think of ourselves now is an invention, a slow that's the idea that you have an inside, you have inner space, you have inner depths that you could search. Maybe there's a true you somewhere in there that you could get to know and be true to. In where? That's a narrative frame, that the self has depth and space, and it's one that has taken about 2,400 years to unfold. So working at a massive scale, we see yet a fifth category of narrative frame. I'll be really fast on this part, which is to say, I think we have to think about narrative threats. If we think that narrative and identity go hand in hand, and that narratives therefore help us make sense of our lives and live good lives, then here are some of the things that worry me, and I'm just going to do like a sentence for each so we can hand the mic to Patrick here. So one is cliches. We live in a culture that loves the shortcut, the cliche, the slogan, and I think that's a threat to having a narrative that's rich enough to help you make sense of your life. So I'll just leave it hanging. We could talk about that if you want. Another is, I would say there's a kind of, I'm Aristotelian. Aristotle thought virtues, right, were the means between two vicious extremes. And here I want to say, we're tacking between a kind of complexity that loses all coherence in our narratives and a kind of coherence that sacrifices complexity. We have a coherent story precisely because we edited out key things. We simplified key things. So a threat to narrative would be tilting toward complexity or coherence and losing track of the other side, rather than trying to live in the difficult space where your stories are not quite complete and not quite coherent, but better than either of the alternatives in either direction. Finally, shouldn't we talk about the elephant in the room, which is ideology? So this barrage of interpolations I'm talking about aren't random and aren't unmotivated. They're part of a social system that is deeply invested in reconciling you to the crappy world we live in. I think I'll just leave it there because it's the closest thing I'll ever get as a philosopher to a mic drop. So, Patrick.
Well, actually, I can just stay here probably. Might be easier. So as Chris mentioned, this is a bit improvisational here. So if I start rambling off in a certain direction, you can feel free to bring me back a little bit here. But I thought one way of approaching this is to talk a little bit of my entryway into familiarity with your work and discuss some of that context and then open it up to three what I see sort of interrelated questions to then perhaps turn it back over here. So I, as was mentioned, I am the program director of the Boston College Prison Education Program. I also, by training, am a higher education researcher. And so what I sort of perceive as taking place in prisons oftentimes is a real battleground of identity, and in this case, narrative identity, that I think oftentimes the students we work with and the population at the prison that expands beyond our students oftentimes are where I'm engaging with them and where our program is engaging with them is at a real low point in their life. We talked about low points, turning points, and sort of high points. Oftentimes incarceration itself represents that low point. I think oftentimes we're dealing with folks and students in our program who have perhaps inflicted real harms in the world, And even if not, even if they maintain innocence within their individual cases, incarceration itself still you're dealing with incarceration and the trauma of that regardless. And so I think what oftentimes can take place in that is you start harboring really negative self-stories about yourself. The stories you tell of your life are ones that are sinking lower and lower. And I think the prison environment also encourages that. The messaging at the prison essentially, I think oftentimes is you're worthless. You are a criminal. There is no value there. And so I think what I'm also then interested in is what are the mechanisms by which there can be narrative reconstruction and growth and renewal within such environments. So I'm not only interested a little bit in the how do we move from, if someone is at a low point, narratively speaking, how do we then, what are the mechanisms by which that can turn to a turning point? What role does education perhaps have to play in that? When I hear you speak, part of what I'm listening to is, and this might be in my own head perhaps, but is almost a defense of the humanities. If coherence in our stories is important, well then what we're exposed to, the depth and complexity of the stories we're able to tell about our lives, how do we develop that? And then thirdly, I think, as I already alluded to, is a little bit of the larger sort of institutional narratives and master narratives that are being told. Particularly in prison environments, I think oftentimes our students, when they're coming to us, they've already decided I want better for myself. I'm going to apply to college. I'm going to start to take a really rigorous course load. I'm going to start envisioning a better future for myself post-release, where I'm developing a career, I'm developing interpersonal connections that are healthy for myself. And yet I think it's often there is a tension then with the broader environment that they are in. A student of ours, I mentioned to you earlier today, who always stands out to me, Carlos, mentioned to me, in the classroom I feel as though I am one person, and I know that I am that person to the instructor and to my peers, and then the second that classroom door closes at the end of class, I all of a sudden turn into, being perceived once again as nothing but a criminal. And he said, I don't know how to ever resolve that. And so that opens up to me, I think, an interesting tension there of what happens when the individual story and the stories we're trying to tell about ourselves and trying to build about ourselves don't align or are in direct contradiction with larger master narratives and larger institutional narratives that are being told about us and the type of people that we're supposed to be. So I suppose to open it back up, the three sort of interrelated questions I had or that were raised for me were, what are some of the materials for growth when someone is at a low point? What are some of the mechanisms of change there that you've observed? What role do institutions have to play in that if there isn't alignment or if there is direct contradiction? And then finally, what role does education have to play in this process? What is the intervention, so to speak, of education or higher education? But those are some of the things that I think, as I was sitting over there improvising away, were some of the thoughts that I had. So I'm happy to turn it back.
Well, thank you so much to our two respondents. I'm also buzzing and simmering with thoughts and questions first, but I'll hand it back to Dan. Are there ways that you want to respond to our respondents or open it up to questions?
Let me say a couple words, but I'll be really brief because that was a lot. And then maybe we could open it up for I just want to endorse Charles Taylor. Go out and get that book, Sources of the Self. I think we are intellectual identical twins raised apart. You know what I mean, Chris? Because that passage from McIntyre is the best passage, and I've quoted it sometimes. I loved how you read it. There's so many really important issues that you raised there. I think one of them that sticks with me especially is the tension between complexity on the one hand and coherence on the other. Stories exist to simplify in part. Our lives are really chaotic and complicated. We need narratives, I believe, to kind of make it somewhat coherent so we can kind of muddle through and get some meaning. But that said, you can overdo it. And there are many examples, I think, in literature, and I've run across a few in research where the story is just too good. It's too pat. It's too coherent and so forth. You need to be open and so on. And I think narratives of acceptance have that value to a certain extent. Yeah, that was one thing I wanted to mention. With respect to your question about resources and how people who are going through incarceration might find material for growth and so forth, I'm a bit at a loss as to what to say. That I think there are so many strikes against you there in those situations. The institutional culture you talked about, I thought was very compelling. This idea that everybody around you is telling you explicitly or implicitly that you're a bad person. I mean, that's why you're in here, right? So how do you get past that? How do you begin to develop a story of reformation and restoration and so on? And I don't know the answer, but I do know there is some research on this by a guy named Shad Marunia, who's a criminologist who's interested in the stories that people who, once they leave prison and try to remake their lives, what kind of stories work. And one of the things he talks about is trying to find something from your past, even if you have to go way, way back, before you broke bad, right? Before you started to go down what you see as the path, whatever that path was that led to your incarceration. Before all that, there was something good, right? There was that time in kindergarten. There were those people you knew in church, whatever. And if you could bring it back in some sense as a base upon which to build a new story, he writes about that, I think, quite eloquently. Finally, let me say, and I think it just comes across in that last comment as well, that I think you folks are much more tuned into the variations, the manifold millions of different kinds of stories that we all tell in our lives. Every story is so rich and beautiful and unique, and I know that, sort of, but my research doesn't show that. I kind of made a deal here. I don't think it's a Faustian bargain, but perhaps it is a little bit, in that I'm trying to find these generic patterns. But in doing so, you just can't do justice to the beauty and the complexity and the interesting kinds of coherences that emerge in any given individual's life. So I think that's partly why I love fiction so much. I love Dostoevsky. I love modern fiction. I love to read about the uniquenesses of people's adaptation to life, the stories that they create that will never be reproduced in any way, shape, or form. That's out there. We have to be sensitive to it. And then on the science side, some of us try to kind of step back and derive some general patterns. And in terms of the humanities, my first major was the humanities. My deepest love, I think, is with the humanities, actually more than psychology, to be truthful. And I don't know if people have read Tara Westover's book, Educated. I just think that is a beautiful account of the value of a liberal arts education and what the humanities can do for you. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily make Tara Westover a blissfully happy person. At the end of that story, and it's an extraordinarily beautifully written story about growing up in a fundamentalist and very deprived kind of context, and then eventually discovering the liberal arts and becoming a different person, she has to give up things. Her good relationships with her family are sort of ruined. And her story is not one of unalloyed triumph and redemption, but she's gained a lot, and she's a fuller, a richer, a more, I think, complex and compelling person, and a more ethically, I think, interesting person than she was before she was educated. So I don't know, I feel that the humanities open us up to all these possibilities and so forth. And maybe they won't make us blissfully happy, but they enrich our lives in ways that I think are very difficult to find otherwise.
Dan, do you remember the epigraph from John Dewey in the beginning of Education?
I don't.
She quotes Dewey saying, "I believe finally that education must be conceived as a continuing reconstruction of experience, that the process and the goal of education are one and the same thing."
Yeah.
Before we open it up to questions, so feel free to get those questions simmering. I'd also love to bring some of the conversations we were having, because we had some tea time with Dan over here before. And as I'm hearing these conversations, I'm also struck by the way certain like social cultural aspects of, and this is along the line of things like narrative therapy, which is a bit simpatico, but draws from a different strain of postmodernism, whether it's institutions like prisons or schools and education. For myself, it's the clinic, right? The ways that we perform certain things as narrative. This is resonant with people like Ricard in terms of like mimesis or living out a plot. We were also talking in terms of this idea of self. Are narratives just the thing that we might make meaning of, or the things that we live out and perform? For example, if I say I value spending time meeting with my friends and people important to me, but I am so busy with all the other narratives that pull me, is that actually a narrative that is important to me, right? So that idea of employment. Also, as we filtered into this room, y'all performed a way of being an audience, right? Nobody really instructed y'all to sit down in the chair, or when somebody sneezed, someone said, "Bless you," right? There's already fragments of these narrative scripts floating around. As Chris is noting, with the dawn of media and whatnot, what are the types of narratives that we actually accidentally ingest and get projected upon? And it could be as quick as a person like Carlos, who is seen in their humanity as a learner, and as soon as they exit the room, reminded of the other narratives that are purported in society. The thing that I'd like, if Dan, you could speak a little to it, is we talked about nadir experiences. So on the flip side of Maslow's hierarchy, there's those peak experiences that we have, but also those low points. And if you ask any person on the street, what's these moments in your life that was the lowest to you, that's usually where people begin in therapy. And I'm fascinated by the way that people begin to access redemption and acceptance depending on their culture, religion, books that they read, the media that they consume, the friends that they have, the fragments of the story that they're more palatable in when they are hitting those low points. And I know I see a lot of nods in the crowds. I know there's a lot of low points in society. So I'm curious what you've seen in terms of nadir experiences, especially as people reconstruct their sense of self. And then we'll open it up to some questions.
Just real quick, narrative therapy is such an interesting thing. I mean, where do we do storytelling? Well, all kinds of different places, but in therapy for sure. It's an interesting experience. I mean, we don't have this very often where you have somebody across from you who's going to sit there and listen and provide you feedback. My sense with narrative therapy is that the therapist's job now becomes kind of like the editor. And so you are working on this narrative, and it's not serving you very well. It's not life affirming in some way or another. And so I'm going to help you rewrite your story. And I think kind of therapists sort of do that anyway, but the narrative therapists have brought this to the foreground, and I think in a very generative way. The metaphor they use is very in keeping with that open quote from Stephen Marcus, that creating a life story that works for you is one, it's not the only, but it's one predictor of well-being and flourishing. So.
First of all, thank you for the amazing talk, and thank you for reminding me of Stephen Marcus, who was an important teacher for me when I was an undergraduate at Columbia. Yeah, he was incredible. And we read Dora, in fact, in the seminar. My question is about the value, in your view, the value of understanding that you are crafting a story. So like a really pivotal moment in my life was when I caught myself in the act of making up the story of my life and realized that I was doing that all the time. And that was both very powerful and quite dangerous, right? This is just something I think about all the time, the stories we tell and their power and their dangers. And it's often very helpful to be able to say, there's something wrong with this story that I'm telling. I want to try to change the story or let go of the story. And so I guess my question for you is, in your research, have you found, is it significant that people understand that they are crafting stories, or is it enough to just have a good story and believe in it? Is that meta level is it helpful or not so much, really?
That's a great question, and I don't have a good answer, because I think in our research we just get the story. We don't ask them about their role as an author. So at what moments in your life do you come to the realization that you're working on your story and so forth? I mean, I could imagine all kinds of interesting research questions that would lead to. I could imagine a program of research on that. But yeah, I think in a way, when I started the work, I was worried about the opposite. I was, not only did they not realize that they're storytellers, and not only do they not realize they have a story, maybe they think the whole thing's bogus, and then like, I'm not a storyteller, I don't have a story, and like, why are you asking me these questions? And so it's like on the other end of it. I do have sort of anecdotal experience just with friends and so forth, of people who I think sort of overdo it when it comes to the storytelling. It's not so much like coming up with the meaning of something in my life at a particular moment. It's more like documenting life as it goes. And so this is before social media and so forth, long ago, back when people wrote postcards. I was at Wrigley Field, where the Cubs play, and Chicago Cub, well, you have Fenway Park here. These are the two great old ballparks, and Wrigley Field for baseball fans is like a shrine. And I came with a friend who was a huge baseball fan, and we were going to watch the game. So we sit down, game hasn't even started yet, and he whips out a postcard and he starts writing about, I am having such a great experience right now. I thought, you're not even watching anything, you're not talking to me, or you're just, and so he was narrating the event almost before it occurred, and I think also in lieu of experiencing the event. So it was kind of a defensive thing, and I was struck by that, So he knew he was narrating, and for him that enhanced the experience. But for me, it was a little bit of a turnoff. But I think the question is really something that it would be so fascinating to explore, and I don't know anybody who's looked at it.
I have a question, maybe more direct towards Professor Conway, but I think you both could also answer it as well. You had spoken about how your student, specifically Carlos, has a personal narrative as a student that which you recognize him like in that role in your prison education program, but then is reminded by the master or institutional narrative that he is a prisoner and like that he doesn't have a lot of worth to society and that he's inherently a bad person. How have you seen that type of situation be reconciled by people, if you have?
Well, to me, that kind of gets that idea of acceptance that was mentioned. Is oftentimes I don't think it can be really reconciled. In fact, that's what his point when he made that was that he said, I don't think it can be reconciled. It's we're on polar opposite views of how I am viewed or what his identity was. So I think it's more just, and it might explain he is one of the more calm people that I know. And it seems like this sense of he's just accepted there is a divergence in how, and unfortunately in his position, there's no resolve in that because he's powerless in that situation. He can't really rebut the narrative of the Department of Corrections. And so I think it's more just sort of, he's going to make meaning within that tension regardless, and he's come to accept that.
Thank you. So I really appreciated the disability studies angle because I think there's something very interesting in the way that often folks get forced into this redemptive narrative when they become disabled. U.S. society wants disabled people to be Daredevil, Captain America, Winter Soldier, and if you can't be that, at least be $1 Million Baby and die really fast if you get disabled. And so I was curious if you had thoughts on narrative resistance. Because I think within the disability studies community, there is tremendous awareness of inspiration porn and of this desire to push back against that narrative. So I was curious if you'd seen that and where that fits into your framework.
There's something like that also in the area of aging. So there are, I teach a course called The Art and Science of Aging, and we read about successful aging. And there's all this writing about successful aging, and basically successful aging means staying young, right? And so, you see these 80-year-olds who are out there surfing, and they're doing this, that, and the other thing, and they're falling in love, and it's good to fall in love at any age. I don't want to put that down, that's for sure. But I mean, it's the same kind of thing. There's this but are there things that are about aging that are unique to aging, that would suggest something really good about aging? So when it comes to the disability area, I'm new to this. John Adler, as I mentioned before, who's just down the road here at Olin College of Engineering, is much more the expert in this arena. But sort of everything you describe, it's kind of thing he talks about. And in terms of the resistance, there is a lot of writing in narrative research today, especially by a woman named Kate McLean, regarding how people push back against what she calls master cultural narratives. And it could be in the realm of disability, but it could be in any realm. That there are these, big stories about how to live a good life. The redemptive self is like that to a certain extent. And they don't work for everybody. And so you can feel bad about not living up to that narrative, or you can maybe repress it, or you can fight back and try to change it. I think in the disability community, there is a lot of pushback now. And so, I think resistance is the way to go if you can do it.
Thanks so much, Dan. And thank you to our respondents and those who have engaged in dialogue virtually and in person. We regret to inform you that this does bring us to the conclusion, but hopefully this is the start of more stories and dialogues together. So join us for our next lecture. Take a look at the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics page for that. But please, let's give another round of applause.